Okay, so thank you, Andrew. This webinar is from Andrew Sporle on the topic of Māori data sovereignty, particularly with respect to the integrated data infrastructure. Andrew is based in the Statistics Department at the University of Auckland, where he lectures on survey methods and official statistics. He also works as a consultant on social and health research. Andrew is a major contributor to Indigenous research in New Zealand. He was formerly the inaugural Māori Health Research Manager at the Health Research Council. He's a founding member of Te Mana Rauranga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And he was also a founding member of the New Zealand Association of Adolescent Health and Development, since transformed into Ara Taihohi. Thanks, Andrew. Go ahead.
Right. Kia ora hui mai koutou. Grande Sport toko ingo no Ngāti Apa Rangatani me te rarawaho. My name is Andrew Sporle, and for better or worse, I think I've had about 30 years being a social science researcher pretending to do epidemiology. This talk is a very quick overview about what's happening in the Māori data sovereignty space, but before we can understand that, we need to understand where we're from. And in terms of where we're from, this is a picture of that I've taken standing on my sacred mountain, Mount Ruapehu, looking northeast towards Auckland. This is one of my happy places. I don't get down there too often. So I do work at Auckland University in the stats department, but a lot of my work now is doing statistical consulting, especially in the data accessibility and visibility space, and I'm one of the project team for Insight Analytics, and currently one of the working with Te Pūnaha Matatini on some of the inequalities work with regards to the epidemic, which is why I've got big bags under my eyes at the moment. Anyway, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the origins of Māori data sovereignty. You know, this thing hasn't just arrived in a vacuum, it's arrived in terms of a historical and social context. Then I'm going to give a brief overview of Te Mana Rauranga and the kind of action that it does, what kind of activities it does and why. And then put the Indigenous Māori data sovereignty into an international context in terms of what is happening on the world stage and how we're affecting international policy at a world level. And then come back to a national context and say, well, actually, what good things are happening here? What okay things are happening here, and what things aren't happening at all. So that's what we're going to do. There are a lot of slides. It's going to be a bit of a movie. If we start, one of the things that when people talk about Māori data sovereignty, they talk about this book on the right, which was a fantastic book edited by Tauri Kukutai and John Taylor. It came out of a meeting funded by the Australian Social Science Academy. Thank you very much, Australian taxpayer, and at ANU. And that looked at various aspects of Indigenous data sovereignty as they were emerging at the time. So that was in terms of what issues people were encountering, what issues were emerging or on the horizon, so we hadn't actually encountered them yet, and what kind of solutions were being created or were possible. And from that meeting, a large number of the presentations were collated in this book that has kind of been the foundational text for looking at data sovereignty, at least in this little corner of the globe. But when we're talking about data sovereignty, data sovereignty talks about data being subject to the laws in the nation in which it is stored. Now that's important. We're going to come back to that later on about the storage issue. But Indigenous data sovereignty takes that, indigenizes that and takes it a step further and says that the data is subject to the laws of the nation from which it is collected. So it's not about storage. It's about from where it's collected, and that includes tribal nations. So this isn't just a possession. This is argument in terms about where it's stored. It's a property argument about owning something and having rights over something no matter where it is. Now, if you think this is new, well, it's not. Way back in about 1914, this guy, Te Rangi Hiroa, also called Peter Buck from Ngāti Mutunga, north of what is now New Plymouth. He was not only the first Māori doctor to graduate in New Zealand, but he actually did the first epidemiological study in New Zealand, and it was published in Australia. And what this was about was him as a Māori doctor looking at gathering research information about to inform a response in local communities to improve their well-being. And rather ironically, what he was looking at was the impact of really poor housing on the flu epidemic that was happening, on the epidemics that were happening between 1914 and 1917. So, just over 100 years later, the very data that he was collecting to inform those local communities is the very data that we don't have in New Zealand because of the census 2018 stuff up. We don't have good quality information about Māori households. But 100 years ago, he was a Māori doctor doing the very first epidemiological study in New Zealand on that very subject. Interestingly enough, his whanaunga, Ero Pōmari, the first Māori Dean of a medical school, took that a bit further, and he created the Hauora Māori Standards of Health series that were published, that created a systematic way of looking at inequalities in the healthcare sector. And previously this work had been done, work by Rose and a few others, but he was the first one to actually initiate this as a systematic review process that was much more comprehensive from what it went before. Then a little bit later in the 1980s, we had this study here, which was, again, it was about Māori communities collecting their own data to inform their own interventions. And this was a study called Rauranga on the health of Māori women. Now, not many of you will probably have heard of this, but you've probably heard of Te Whare Tapa Whā, the Māori health model. This is where that came from. Now, this particular study was done by the Māori Women's Welfare League, and it was a national study, or almost national study. And it was about Māori collecting their own data in a regional way to inform regional interventions. And it's a fantastic book, piece of research and publication, so much so that, oops, I'm going backwards here, so much so that I've had about 3 or 4 copies stolen by students. So my last copy is bolted down. But so this is, we were doing this work in the 1980s. It was very much about data sovereignty. We weren't calling it that, but this is what this practice was. Since then, there have been other good news stories. The Wairarapa Asthma Project was a similar example. In the Wairarapa, they were looking at how to control or do something about the really high rate of hospitalisations for asthma amongst Māori in that region. And they collected local information and formed an intervention that worked locally, but it also worked internationally and was exported to about 19 different countries. Now, all of those last 3 projects had people in common. And they're all people in common who ended up being involved in the original Māori Health Committee of the Health Research Council. So those were people like Ero Pōmari is the chair of that, right? Ira Hapiti Murchie was the lead in Rauranga. Neil Pearce, who was Ero Pōmari's epidemiologist, was in behind the Te Reo o Te Ora and helping that get off the ground. And that happened in his research group. Now, they set the context for doing research in a Māori way using Māori research funds, and that has led to some other really useful community-led, data-driven innovations that are actually, they're exercises in data sovereignty. Now, this one is David Tiffany Letcher's team's work on Waihakura, the sleeping pods, Pepe sleeping pods. Again, it was a community intervention, but they did a clinical trial of this in the community and demonstrated that these things were just as safe as bassinets, so they were actually able to implement these and roll them out as an intervention. So what these have actually shown is that, yes, there has been data sovereignty in action at regional and local levels, and that's been able to create national level partnerships, local level partnerships that have actually informed national level action, but in doing so created really new and novel solutions that have worked not only for Māori, but outside of Māori domains as well. Now, there's other fantastic news stories. Those of you who know about Stan Walker's story, the discovery of the CDH1 gene, which is the definitive cause for diffuse gastric cancer in his family, was another exercise in data sovereignty, where the family did the genealogical research and worked in partnership with the geneticists to share information, and as a result, they were able to find this gene very, very quickly. It has now gone worldwide. More about that in a moment. There's community level interventions. There's the local iwi on the far side of Ruapehu, if I'd looked in the other direction from where that original photograph was taken. Those communities in there were led by an iwi initiative to do data-informed community development. And as a result, this is actually the Ruapehu Whānau Transformation Project has emerged and is actually changing how social and wellbeing interventions are being delivered across this rural area with the small towns. In addition, there's initiatives within Genetics Aotearoa in terms of Māori governance over Māori data. The Whānau Water social service delivery model has actually generated new data systems to inform whānau-orientated data in the absence of government data, which couldn't actually deal with this concept of whānau because it's never really collected much information about that. And much more recently in the Science for Technological Innovation, they are investing to support Māori data and data sovereignty activities as a key work theme in what they do. A little bit about the McLeod whānau and what they did with the stomach cancer project. So what we can see here is Stan Walker's grandfather, Rangi McLeod in the background there with the glasses, and the three amazing women who drove this project. And what they did was they took data that nobody else had access to about their genealogy and added to it in a way that enabled a gene to be discovered really, really quickly. And it was a combination of two sources of knowledge, but with a distinct governance system. And that distinct governance system was based on being able to possess and control what happened to data. So the family had absolute control over the genealogical information and the genetic information. And so there was a very strong co-governance model that evolved organically, actually, as it happened, in this research project that meant that it was able to do its work really, really effectively and quickly, and they got a Nature publication. And there's Perry Guilford, who's the geneticist, and this now has changed how this particular this form of cancer is researched, but also how the clinical guidelines are developed worldwide, which is now affects over 500 kindreds worldwide, thanks to the combined leadership of the whānau and the geneticists. So this is the, if anybody's interested in the Ruapehu Whānau Transformation Plan, it's absolutely fantastic project. It's regional development, but it's driven by collating information about that region and the local community using that to determine where it's going to intervene, how it's going to intervene, and also evaluating the responses. And it's a case of data sovereignty in action at a regional level through partnership structures between iwi and local government. A similar model just down the road is Te Kiti Tu Atia, which was the Rangatiki Iwi Collective, have also done a data-driven plan about strengthening identity and connection. And the same people who were involved with the Ruapehu project were involved with this. Again, it's about getting data and using data to determine sovereign actions. Oops. It also happens at a local government level. Here in New Zealand, here in Auckland, the Independent Māori Statutory Board of Auckland Council has actually been collating information and data about Auckland in ways that have never been done before. pushing Stats New Zealand to both provide information, but also collate information that hasn't been collated before, to produce information that is not just about people, but about place and about economy at a regional level, to inform and challenge local government actions. And in doing so, they've actually come up with a Māori plan for Auckland with lots of domains, and each of these domains has measurements that and data that guide it in terms of informing it, but also in terms of informing the evaluation as well. In addition to this is iwi level arrangements where central government is directly building relationships on the ground about data with local iwi. Now, up north, where some of my roots are from, the Te Huku Social Accord enable iwi to have access to any government data about their region. So it's a fantastic initiative. It's been was signed off by a Prime Minister, and they quite often have to waive that signature at various government agencies in order to say, well, actually, we've got access to data about our people as of right, as per this agreement. But this has been a groundbreaking initiative, but also we have to realise that when you get access to data, you also need some data systems and some data infrastructure. But they're getting there. And so this is a direct relationship between central government and Māori at a local and regional level. In terms of overall governance level, at a larger picture, this is where the Iwi Chairs Forum come in. Now, the Iwi Chairs Forum are an open collective of chairs of various iwi governance groups. It's got about 70 iwi involved. And what they're doing is they're leading a co-governance and co-design discussion with government about the creation and governance of the data system right across government. So it's a whole of government approach. And that's a direct partnership at a governance level. So that's another level again. So that's a level between iwi governance and ground governance. So that's some of the initiatives, a quick overview of some of the initiatives that are happening. So, but when we're talking about Māori data, what do we mean? What do we mean? So data could be considered Māori data if it's data from Māori. So it's data that we as Māori have produced ourselves. It could come from Māori individuals, Māori organisations or businesses. It could be data about Māori as generated by others, and that's especially where it's being used to describe or compare Māori collectives, or you can identify collectives within it. So it's get Māori identifiers in it. Or it could be data about Māori resources, no matter who's generated them. And that could be resources about natural resources, about cultural resources, about data resources. So that's not necessarily about people, that could be about place and other things. So quite an encompassing definition. So in the context, if that's Māori data, why is Māori data sovereignty important? Well, Māori data sovereignty is important because data has use value, right? It's like a book. It doesn't actually have much value just sitting on a shelf. Its value is being able to access it and use and apply it and use it to transform the lives of our people. And enabling that to happen means that we actually have to have some governance over the data, about how it's collected, how it's stored, how it's used, who collects it and who can use it, and control over those processes to ensure that the data is relevant and it's responsive to our people. Because if we don't do this, if we don't have a data system that can inform Indigenous development, we're going to be in a situation where we don't actually get the benefit of this. So we're actually empowering others to do things about us rather than empowering us to do things for ourselves. And our stories will remain untold. So how did all of this emerge in New Zealand? Well, in New Zealand, just not that many years ago, there was a fantastic initiative about linking data. And the integrated data infrastructure was being created, and it's a fantastic initiative. It's a really world-leading initiative. But this reuse of data and the linking of the secondary use of data and the linking of data in ways that wasn't necessarily foreseen when data was originally provided, meant that there were some discussions that needed to be had about some of the value systems of this approach, both in terms of the values that were inherent in the data, but also the value systems in this approach of just being able to do what you want with data because it was already there. In addition, there were some concerns about this wanting to be used by the former Minister of Finance, Bill English, as a primary source for informing about $40 billion worth of social investment a year. And we were saying, well, actually, there's big gaps in this data. So you can't actually, this data is a limited use to tell stories about us or inform interventions for us, because either the quality's not there, sorry, the data's there, but it's poor quality, or the the information's not there at all. And so what we're faced with is the emergence of this fantastic technological tool, but it was getting more complex and decreasingly accessible, especially to people who really wanted access to information for their own development. So there was some awareness of the value of this data, and there was demand for access it, but there were these really high technical barriers to actually access this data, and those remain, because you basically have to be a SAS or a SQL or a heavy data user, or a highly skilled statistical programmer, or very familiar with tools like SPSS. So the issue then became, well, are these official statistics resources for us, or they are about us? Are they a tool of empowerment, or are they a tool of disempowerment, effectively? And are those national level data resources all that useful for informing local responses? Because Māori initiatives are locally driven, right? That governance is local. So are those data resources appropriate to what we do? And in doing that, we had to sort of address, make the Crown realise that the data resources that they have, right, were collected for purposes that don't necessarily meet our needs, but in fact, quite often we're actively contrary to our needs. And for those of you who know the history of the Great South Road that was driven from Auckland into the Waikato, that road was a military road that was targeted towards strategic and economic resources that were to be seized from Māori, and the information about where those resources were actually came from some of the early censuses. So in this context, Te Mana Rauranga arrived, and this is where we come into a little story. Okay, so Te Mana Rauranga didn't exist prior to that Australian event. As a result of that Australian event, we're all sharing various modes of transport. And we decided, well, actually, we're onto something here. This has actually got legs. This is, conceptually really, really useful. And it seems to be addressing a need. So how can we make this permanent? And the first thing we did was one of our members came up with a name. So, okay, we've got a name. We're now an organisation. So somebody said, well, actually, to be an organisation, you really need a website. So we then came up with a website. We made a website. So we were really real. So, and then we came up with a logo to put on the website, because the website needed some content. And so we were the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, Te Mana Rauranga, right? And the idea here is we were a group of people who were interested in data, who were data advocates, so we're very pro-data, but we saw the value of data as being aligned with the value of land. In fact, Kitty Kōwhaimakaire, the Chief Technical Advisor to the EV Leaders Group, data group, described data as the new land, and that kind of metaphor resonates with us, because just as with land, if you lose land, it's gone, very hard to get back. Similarly with data, if you lose control of data, if you lose ownership of data, or if you lose the possession of data, it's very hard to get back. But also the data is a valuable strategic asset for Māori development as well. So defining Māori data sovereignty, we consider it to be the right of Māori to access, to use, to have governance and control over Māori data. And those last two are important, right? It's not just about access to and use, it's about governance and control. Because governance and control enables you to determine those other aspects, right? You've got decision-making power over your own data. And to Rauranga, we decided that our role as people who were interested in data was as an advocacy group. And we were advocating that data was a good thing, and we needed to develop the capacity and capability of the Māori data ecosystem. And that included data rights and interests, data governance, data storage and security, and data access and control over data resources. So who was this group? Well, actually, we were an eclectic bunch of people who worked in the space of data and IT technology. There were people who came from the tribal data, sort of the tribal realm, either working in governance or with tribal data, or the tribal enrolments or advocacy. We had people from the Māori economic sector using business data, or from digital businesses, or from the healthcare sector. And we had a strong sector from Māori academia, especially from demography and health statistics and in the Indigenous knowledge domains. And what that did was give a diversity of membership, so that when we put the call out for our first real meeting, we ended up with a really diverse and large membership. And that meant that we could coordinate a singular voice across lots of the domains of the economy and lots of the domains of the data, various data and IT sectors, and government, the public sector, but also not just the public sector, but the private sector as well. How do we operate? Well, we operated in actually, I'll back up. I'll back up first. Our very first meeting, right, wasn't actually a meeting that we organised ourselves. It was a meeting that was a partnership between Treasury and Stats New Zealand. It was about the value of integrated data and what some of the issues were for Māori data. And the government statistician, Liz McPherson, had called this meeting of Māori leaders and people interested in Māori data. And we sat there and we all did whakawhanaungatanga at the beginning, introducing ourselves. And what we'd arranged is those of us who'd actually been in the Australian event and had been in discussions after that, all stood up and said our names and said, we are members of Te Mana Rauranga, the Māori Data Sovereignty group. So as we were all doing our introductions around the room, right, and there was several hundred people in this room, all these people stood up and said they were members of Te Mana Rauranga. People going, who are these? Who's this group, right? And we had a name, and we were halfway through building our website, but we weren't actually an active group. It was a really effective way of actually getting our network publicised, because lots of people were in that room. And then at the end of the stats in the New Zealand /Treasury hui, we said to the government statistician, actually, could we borrow one of your rooms? Because I think it's about time we had our first meeting. So our first meeting was actually in the first floor of what used to be Stats New Zealand House in Wellington. And then after that, we decided that how we were going to operate. And that was going to be that we were advocates, right? We were not going to operate in the governance space. We had this mana mahi sort of conceptual split in our working model. And the mana side of things was dealing directly with governance, right? And that wasn't our role. We saw our role as kind of operational in terms of making connections and working with the public sector, but not the governance level of public sector. So we were down here in the mahi segment, working directly with government agencies. The mana role, the tribal leaders, they were dealing directly with government ministers. And there was some crossover, some tribal data technical advisors were in both groups. But our role was very much in working directly with government agencies as advocates primarily. And so in creating the role and creating some space so that, if the discussions, the mana discussions led to some decisions, then the government agencies were willing to or could act on those, but also the government agencies could also inform their ministers in a way that was consistent with the information and requests and discussions that were coming from tribal leaders. So then we decided to create a website. And in creating a website, what we did was we decided that as advocates, right, this was our role was as path cutters. Our role was to advocate for a need and make it easier for other people to follow. So we produced a website, and on that we produced, the first thing we did was we produced a charter, and that charter guided us in terms of what things we would do and how we would do it, kind of basically our scope of works. But then what we then did was said, well, actually, this isn't just about us. This is about, as I say, cutting a path. So how do we make this easier for other people to follow? So we spent, the next piece of work we did was to create Māori Data Sovereignty principles. Principles of Māori Data Sovereignty that were published on the website that other people could use and apply in their own context. So the idea about this website was to be a go-to place for resources. So that we're now moving into an additional realm. So we had our advocacy role, but now we're actually producing resources that other people could follow. And those resources, since then, have led to things like the Māori data audit tools that are available on our website. So we're an open network. Anybody's available to join as long as they're interested in Māori data and working in the Māori data space. And the idea is that we are there to support initiatives, but not necessarily do the work ourselves. We're kind of creating a space for this to happen. And our charter is, this is a very brief summary, but basically our intent was to enable Māori data sovereignty and advance Māori aspirations for a collective and individual well-being using data. So very much in the data advocacy space. We're not here to say no, we're saying this is really valuable, but it needs to be done right and correct. And in order to guide that, we came up with our principles, and the 6 principles can be found on our website, and they basically translate to having authority to gather and use data, that the relationships that are inherent in the data process, obligations of the data process on the various actors involved. The data system actually has to be there for collective and not just individual benefit. And those collectives need to reflect the different collectives for Māori than they are necessarily for the collectives that might be of interest to the Crown. In terms of reciprocity, that data is given, is something of value that is given over, and because it's given over freely, people, there should be an obligation to return some value in recognition for that. And that value should actually be empowering as well. But also, because what we've received in the data system is of value, there are roles of guardianship and protection and kaitiakitanga that need to be enacted. So that's what how the Te Mana Rauranga evolved, right? So we started from a meeting, and then we grew, we did some foundational work, and now, as recently as yesterday, we're having open public hui talking about where to next, and some both general principles, but some working exemplars that other people can use. But this all exists also in an international context, so that this didn't happen in isolation as well, because the Indigenous data sovereignty movement has come out of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also WHO's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. I'll come back to those. But there are other things going on as well. And in particular, the First Nations Indigenous governance group in the Cree Nation, basically, they are well and truly ahead of us on here. But that has something to do with the different constitutional arrangements in Canada. So the Cree Nation, for example, and FNIGC have produced these OCAP principles of ownership, control, access and possession with regards to data sovereignty in their own space. So Indigenous data sovereignty is now an international movement. There are national level organisations in New Zealand, obviously, in the United States, in Australia. There's also now one in Mexico, there's one in Norway, there's an emerging one in Sweden. There are tribal nations doing this work in Canada. The Basque Nation are very interested in this within Spain as well. And so what this led to was this fantastic workshop in in Oñati, one of the oldest universities in Spain, and yes, that is me on my phone. This was an international movement, international meeting about Indigenous data sovereignty and how this could be worked into an international movement. And we had so many parallels that it decided that what we'd do is we'd form GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And it was about promoting Indigenous control of Indigenous data. So this is lifting the policy gaze above the national level. And we're now going into the international level with the idea that there are certain policies about data that are addressed internationally that set the context for what happens at a local level. So let's engage at that national level. And so this Global Indigenous Data Alliance was formed. And so this is the umbrella organisation. And this, it's run out of the Native Nations Institute in Arizona, but they have, GIDA had very similar definitions about what they consider Indigenous data to what we do here with regards to Māori data. And one of the things that GIDA did was come up with the idea of care principles. So some of you who work in the data space, especially the research data space, will have come across the principles of data management that are called the FAIR principles, about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Well, GIDA came up with supplementary principles. Right? They're not intended to replace, but they're saying, well, actually, yeah, those are important, but there's some other values that are really, really important with regards to data management and data curation. And they are that data has collective benefit, that there needs to be recognition of Indigenous people to have authority to control their own data, that there are responsibilities for data collectors and data custodians to look after Indigenous data and make it available and make it governable by Indigenous nations, and the fact that there might be different ethical parameters that need to be considered with regards to ethical data. Now, we thought there might be a little bit of pushback on this from the Indigenous data community, but we found anything but. What we did find is that it provided a really useful way to move beyond these international principles and incorporate the Indigenous principles that were coming through the various national level Indigenous data sovereignty movements. And so what GIDA then did was start to engage at this international level. And so that we've formed a section of the Research Data Alliance that talks specifically about Indigenous data sovereignty in that space. And we've had a very strong presence in all their conferences and leading workshops at an international level, determining policy about international data in the research context. So that's one area that we engaged in. The other most recent one is working with the International Engineering Group, which sets policy for sort of data practice. And here we've formed a group recently looking at recommended practice for provenance of Indigenous people's data. So this is in the highly technical end of data. So we've gone to their umbrella organisation and we're working in the policy realm within that umbrella organisation. Also, in the those of you who are of the open data space, we've also involved with reviewing the Open Data Charter. And so we had a very strong representation at the International Open Data Conference in Madrid in 2016. And in that, as a result of that, we have been able to include limitations on the open data by default approach, which was one of the fundamentals for the Open Data Charter. We actually got them to be able to include other recognition that that might not always be the appropriate context or the appropriate way to use and make data available if the data is actually Indigenous. Right, if I'm going to leave any time for questions, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. But anyway, so how do we get here in terms of New Zealand, right? So so that's the international context. So we've actually started to engage internationally through an international organisation at the international policy level. Back here in New Zealand, how do we actually make data sovereignty happen? Well, the iwi Chairs Forum, the Data Leadership Group, has come up with an ETI model, Kiri Kowhai Makare's ETI model, and that is based on having access and governance over information, being able to have people who can use and access and use the data translators, but also having an infrastructure to make it possible for us to control and design the data future for our people. And the iwi Chairs Data Leadership Group have actually got a strategy for engaging this, and it's kaupapa Māori informed. In fact, it's more than informed, it's embedded. And you can see here that it's all about getting that ETI model in action. So what kinds of things are happening? Very quickly. Okay, so we've seen from the whānau transformation program, we've got some data use work, data-driven regional development activities happening, and that was being driven by local community in iwi. Local government, we have statutory-driven sort of data sovereignty being realised or actualised in terms of monitoring local government. The iwi Chairs Forum have got a mana ōrite agreement with the Crown, and the co-governance of official statistics has been discussed as part of that. There have been various research projects that have been breaking new ground, creating that kind of infrastructure, being able to make tribal data boundaries, being able to include Māori wellbeing metrics in research and official statistics, being able to do Māori regional capabilities indices, moving away from deprivation indices, creating Māori longitudinal capability within data infrastructure, and various visualizers for that could be used to apply to data and to reduce the technological barriers and technical barriers in accessing New Zealand's data resources. Some of you may have been aware of the Data Futures Partnership, which used to be called the Data Futures Forum, that came up, was talking about how do we get social license and to look at our use of data resources. Now, this came about because of those concerns I mentioned very early on about data linkage and things. So this was some engagement led by the Data Futures Partnership about social license. As Te Mana Rauranga was involved with a response to that said, well, actually, social license isn't sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There also needs to be a cultural license that is much more engaged, that is based on consultation, which is ongoing formative engagement, not just a talk in a corridor. So we came up with a response that, to this as a data sovereignty movement that was led by, and that was talked about cultural license. And in addition to that, we started doing our own thing. And so the Science, Technological Innovation and the Data iwi Leaders Group started having hui about Māori data futures, right? This is about us determining our own future rather than just being a tack on to another Crown initiative. And as a result of this, we started producing models about how the value systems for accessing linked data and data resources. And again, these can be found on the Te Mana Rauranga website. So, are we there yet in terms of achieving Māori data sovereignty? Well, there's lots of examples that are local initiatives, right, that are working pretty well, right? There's some localised change in government, especially within data-heavy aspects of government, like Ministry of Social Development, with their move away, or their funding of projects on regional Māori strength-based indices that are community-driven. So there's some fantastic work happening within government agencies at a small level, but there is no systematic or systemic responses yet. And in fact, the co-governance discussion is only just beginning. And that was signed October last year between the iwi Leaders Forum and Stats New Zealand. But there have been some successes. And where those successes have occurred, they've basically been initiatives primarily funded by research, right? The really fundamental change hasn't actually been in the policy realm, really, okay? It's been in researchers changing their domain and practice in their domain. It's been very practice driven. It's been focused on what is best practice rather than what is suitable policy. And so there's been engagement about national ethical standards for the new standards about research. And this starts talking about data sovereignty and cultural license in those key terms. And this is one of those foundational documents that determine research practice in New Zealand. In addition, we were somewhat challenged by MB's refusal to revisit the Vision Mātauranga Māori responsiveness policy that it had for research. It was 17 years old and I think 3 agencies old. We asked them to update that, and we wanted with one of the specific focuses to be on research data and data sovereignty and the role of both of those in Māori advancement. MB said no, and they weren't going to do it because it was too big a job. So we said, well, what needs to happen? And when I say we, it was Rauranga Mangai. So this was the Māori Data Sovereignty movement was actually also part of the Māori directors of the National Science Challenges. And so we teamed up with Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor and said, okay, how do we make this happen in response to policy inertia? And we wrote the policy book ourselves and gave it to MB and said, look, this is coming from the National Science Challenges. So we're actually going to fill the policy void with some indications of what could be good practice. And the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor actually supported our advocacy, and we joined up with the Royal Society and Ngāpai and others and to lobby directly to the Minister, and we got some funding to change the policy environment within MB to make it much more responsive to Māori. So here's the, but foundational to the future of all of this is this, right? It's a Mana Ōriti relationship agreement. And this is the relationship agreement between Stats New Zealand and the Iwi Chairs Forum that talks about the process of working through the issues about Māori data and co-governance and realising the potential of Māori data. So this is moving away from the advocacy that Te Mana Rauranga has done into active engagement at the governance level. This is actually unfortunately moving really, really slow because as those of you who have been following Stats New Zealand and the census, Stats New Zealand is a massively under-resourced organisation at the moment. But at least these discussions are happening and they have a framework for working through. So are we there yet? Well, yeah, there are lots of examples at the local level. So there's local initiatives happening and that's fantastic. And they're producing sort of some exemplars to follow, but also there's some practice guidance coming from the documents like the principles or the Rauranga Mangai publication about Vision Mātauranga. There has been some limited response from some agencies, but that has been really program specific within those agencies. It hasn't been systematic. In fact, what we're finding is within agencies, somebody going, oh, you've got to address Māori data sovereignty. So go and talk to this group, right? Even within a single agency, there's no singular response to this. It seems to be program by program. But what is happening is there's been Māori responses to fill that policy void. And when there's a policy void, we can either sit back and wait for the Crown to do it, or we can get active and create through practice good exemplars or principles to follow that are actually by default become policy because there's nothing else there. Right? And so if you get enough people doing that, then that works really well. And that's been really effective in the research area. So the concepts that we've been using in Māori data sovereignty are now right throughout the research funding system. So they're embedded in academia and they're actually driving practice, data practice that is funded through research dollars. And because they're driving data practice, they're creating, there's an expectation. This is how things should be, right? And if you're not doing it this way, you probably won't get funded. Or if you're not doing it this way, you should go and look at that group over there because they're doing it the right way. But that said, there has been a general policy response inertia, right? And that is, we're not talking either rapid policy change here or incremental change. We're talking virtually no change, right? And it's been really, really frustrating. There's been small movements, right? But most of the impetus for this is actually coming from Māori themselves, be they researchers or advocates or at the governance level. This is not only concerning, it's actually distressing, because two things have happened this year that don't look good for the future. So although we actually have been making some progress, and it's great, there's two really distressing things that are actually going to really affect the implementation of Māori data sovereignty and the application of Māori data to inform Māori development in the future. Now, the first of those was a deliberate decision from Cabinet earlier this year to fund the next census at a level that they knowingly, that will knowingly undercount Māori. Right? So they've decided, they were given 4 options for funding the next census, and they chose the cheapest option, under the advice that this will once again undercount Māori. So it will be the 3rd census in a row where we've had significant undercount for Māori. In addition to that, there is a direct intention from government that has been declared to offshore all New Zealand's official statistics. So they're going to be cloud stored offshore. Not here, not even necessarily with a backup here, but everything's going to be offshored. And that's all New Zealand data. And that is, at the moment, the policy of Department of Internal Affairs and Statistics New Zealand. Now, a Pākehā friend of mine who works in cybersecurity in Canberra described this as just big buckets of effing stupid, right? In terms of a general data sovereignty. He said he just couldn't believe it. He's a Kiwi working in Australia. He said that is one of the dumbest data decisions he's ever heard from a data sovereignty point of view. But from an Indigenous data sovereignty point of view, what that means is we are now susceptible, somebody else now holds our data. It might be encrypted, right? But we no longer have possession. We no longer have direct control. And it makes the kind of opportunities that we had started talking to the Crown about shared data repositories, right? About co-created data repositories, about dual control systems. It makes those impossible because the data is now going to be overseas. It's not going to be housed here at all. And so we've got a bit of a fight on our hands, because unless we address this issue, a lot of the potential for data sovereignty, Māori data sovereignty in this country actually go out the window. So one of the first things we need to address is this idea that we need to offshore all data. The technology's there. We could onshore this. We could have mirrored systems within New Zealand that were secure, that did not cross internet nodes, right? We're not in the hands of Australians. We're not susceptible to having cables cut or loss of access, as we've seen recently in some of the denial of service attacks that have kept really well-funded groups and businesses away from their data resources. This can't be allowed to happen. And so these two are going to be our next immediate challenges. And after the election, expect to see some action on these two fronts. So that said, Te Mana Rauranga is now a permanent part of the data system in New Zealand. Yesterday's Hui has just brought on another whole new cohort of members and people who are interested to be active in the data space, and Māori technologists and data scientists. So it's actually going to be a really exciting time, despite the challenges. But out of challenges come new things. That said, if you're interested in this sort of Indigenous data sovereignty and policy, one of the reasons for doing this talk is a not so subtle plug for a book that's coming out next month on Indigenous data sovereignty and policy. And it's got all of the usual suspects who've been involved with GIDA and in Australia and the United States and Canada, and in Europe, involved in this publication. And there are chapters in there on, 2 chapters there specifically on what's happening in New Zealand, with lots of references, going into a lot more detail that this very quick overview hasn't been able to. So thanks very much for your time. I've used up rather a lot of it, but I am very willing to stick around and answer some questions.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. That was really interesting. Do we have any questions? There's none in the chat so far. Sarah, did you have anything?
No.
What is the reason for storing the data offshore? Is it a cost thing?
Yep. I can think of no other reason. Yeah, I mean, we have been going to big data storage. We're looking at, New Zealand is a big user of commercial data storage facilities. Data storage as a service, the likes of Fujitsu, for example. Fujitsu run the IDI for Stats New Zealand. So there's this model that, New Zealand doesn't have a great track record with designing and implementing technology at this scale. So I think it's a combination of cost and risk.
Right.
And risk in terms of IT failure. I mean, we've got some fantastic exemplars of IT failure in New Zealand, from the police to MSD to but this is something that we could do, and we could do right, and we could do in a way that could create a strategic data resource for New Zealand that would be of international significance. We don't actually have to give our data away for letting somebody else do it. Yeah, but it's basically risk-averse bureaucrats thinking, oh, this looks a less risky and cheaper option than doing it here.
Right.
Yeah, I'd seen a report that was, a policy suggestion that with the possible winding down of the Tiwai's Point aluminium smelter, that would be the electricity resources that might be available for such, because they were no longer being used by the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter, might actually be available for a data center provision in Southland. However, we've recently heard that there's been an extension granted to the renegotiations for the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter, and so that's it's interesting that that's the movement when the data provision in New Zealand could be done, and it could be done in a relatively environmentally friendly way, using existing energy resources.
Yeah, and given that the windy and cool environment down at Tiwai Point, it's a perfect place to actually have.
Yeah, it would be a great spot to have it.
Yeah, to have huge heat producing service. Yeah, I mean, we need to get creative like that. We could actually have a data storage industry in New Zealand that was actually really environmentally friendly, because the one big server farms that they have in the United States are really ugly, inefficient, in terms of and non-green. We could do something really cool down there. Also, I mean, some people have confidence in New Zealand's data system. Microsoft just declared that they're going to be investing in a Azure node for in the North Island here. So, it just needs some vision. I would actually be really keen. I can see our data system being used as I say, strategic, not only strategic national resource, but an international research resource, whereby people are willing to pay to use it within New Zealand. They'd have to come here for issues that were of relevance to New Zealand, but could answer questions of international significance. Yeah. Like, for example, the migration to New Zealand, the Polynesian migration to New Zealand occurred 20 years before a similar migration into California. So in terms of the social dynamics and the demographics, the United States could learn a lot from us. And interestingly, they're willing to pay. I was at a seminar at Stanford, and they said, talking about the integrated data infrastructure, and there was a Swedish person there said, well, our data is better, but yours is probably easier to get and more aligned to research, because theirs is all housed in separate registers, right? And No, yeah, ours is reasonably easy to get. And so the question from Stanford was, well, what would it take for us to access it? And I said, well, actually, you can't access it. You need to be in New Zealand, and the project needs to be of relevance to New Zealand. They went, oh, that's all right, that's fine. So what would it cost? What would it cost? And I said, oh, about 500. What? And they went, what, only $500,000? I went, no, $500. Yeah. And they just burst out laughing. And they said, we'd pay millions for that, right? Because, and I said, really? And they said, yeah, because they, for example, wanted to create their own census longitudinal study, which New Zealand already has. And so in order to do that, Stanford, the social science section of Stanford, decided they were going to create that. So they are digitally scanning every single census record from the United States. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, billions, right? And I said to this guy, I said, that's huge. How can you afford to do that? And he said, when you got 20 million in the bank, you can 20 billion in the bank, you can do whatever you like.
Oh wow!
And he started talking about New Zealand's sitting on a strategic resource of international significance. Yeah. And he said, well, how long does it take to get access to these linked data resources? And the Swedish person said, well, in Scandinavia, it takes about 18 months and can be about $180,000 to actually get access. And so the guy from Stanford said, well, so New Zealand's $500. How long does it take? I went, 6 weeks. Yeah. And he said, and you actually get the data. And I said, well, you've got data on a network. It doesn't get sent to you. You have to be a pre-approved user, and you get cut a subset. And he said, why aren't you doing something major with this? He said, people would pay extraordinary money to be able to use that as a confidential research resource with appropriate governance and stuff. It's not about sending data overseas. It would actually have to be. He said, because you're sitting on something immensely valuable that nobody else could do. And so this idea that we are both going to join up an IDI with very poor governance and do some things that are, you could argue that they weren't necessarily social license for, like some of the Band-Aid work that they did for the census, right? And then put all of that overseas, right? Just doesn't mesh, right? We need to think different, and and by thinking different, we could actually do something really, really, really cool that addresses Māori data sovereignty, but also does create something that is really fantastic for this country.
So the risk would be essentially, if it was stored here and there were people internationally using it, at least then it would kind of involve partnering with New Zealand researchers and kind of understanding the context around that data, versus if it was stored overseas, that would be lost.
Yes. So if the issue with being stored overseas is you can be separated from it.
Right.
All it needs is breaking the connection.
Right.
They might have the same access protocols, but what we're saying that if there is to be any overseas access to New Zealand data, it has to be a New Zealand-led project based in New Zealand, with people who understand the New Zealand context, who are interpreting the output in relation to that context. The governance models have to be there, but also those international partners who are still getting something really valuable out of it. They're building capability there, so that they're leaving something behind, being people or infrastructure or systems, so that we can actually get more value from the data that we can that we're doing, that we have rather. But definitely it has to be a very any international involvement has to be in New Zealand and New Zealand led, and with all sorts of governance and security and output controls. I would be a very strong advocate against any overseas-led sort of data mining or research activities that happen with these data resources.
Yeah. Awesome.